April 18, 1942, 1:30 p.m. Tokyo time. The B-25 Mitchell bomber Bat out of hell crosses the Japanese coast at 15,500 feet, throttles wide open. Staff's Sergeant Jacob DeShazer is in the nose, hunched over a Norden bomb site he was told not to bring. He is 29 years old, from Madras, Oregon, and he has never seen a city before this morning. Below him is Nagoya. The pilot, Lieutenant William Farrow, asks him over the intercom if he has the target. DeShazer says he has it. He toggles 4 500-pound demolition bombs over a Mitsubishi aircraft works and an oil tank farm. Then the navigator tells him they have 90 minutes of fuel left and 600 miles of open ocean between them and any friendly territory. The plan, the one signed off by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle and approved by Admiral Ernest King and President Roosevelt, and was for the 16 B-25s of the raid to fly onto airfields in unoccupied China after striking Japan. The plan assumed favorable winds. The plan assumed the carrier USS Hornet would launch them within 400 miles of the Japanese coast. The plan failed at 0738 hours on April 18th when a Japanese picket boat sighted the task force 650 miles out, and Doolittle ordered an immediate launch, 170 miles farther from Japan than briefed, with no margin for fuel. Crew 16, the last bomber to leave the deck, had the least margin of all. But to understand what kept Jacob DeShazer alive through what came next. Through 40 months of solitary confinement, through 3 of his fellow raiders being shot in a Shanghai cemetery, through 34 months under his own death sentence, we have to look back to who he was before April 18th. DeShazer was not a career soldier. He was a sheep farmer from Central Oregon who enlisted in the Army Air Corps in February 1940 because the Depression had taken the family pasture. The surface, he volunteered for the Doolittle mission in March 1942 without being told what it was. The man who would later change the religious history of post-war Japan was, at the moment he toggled those bombs over Nagoya, an Oregon farm boy who had never been outside the United States until 8 weeks earlier. At 9:30 p.m. on April 18th, Bat out of hell ran out of fuel over the Chinese province of Jiangxi in driving rain at 7,000 feet. Farrow ordered the 5-man crew to bail out. DeShazer jumped third. His parachute opened. He landed in a cemetery outside the village of Nanking, broke nothing, and walked through rain for the rest of the night without seeing another human being. At dawn he found a farmhouse. He knocked on the door. The Chinese family who opened it spoke no English. They gestured for him to come inside. They fed him rice. They were the last people who would treat him as a guest for the next 3 years and 4 months. By noon on April 19th, a Japanese patrol arrived at the farmhouse. DeShazer was bound, blindfolded, and trucked to a military airfield. Within 48 hours he had been transferred to Shanghai. Within a week, he was in Bridge House Prison, the headquarters of the Japanese Fengtai, the military secret police, in the international settlement. He was held with 4 other raiders. Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, the pilot of Crew 6, the Green Hornet, Lieutenant William Farrow, his own pilot, Lieutenant Robert Hite, Lieutenant George Barr, and Sergeant Harold Spatz. 2 more raiders from Crew 6, Lieutenant Robert Meader and Sergeant Chase Nielsen, were brought in the following week. 8 Americans. 1 cell block. The interrogations began immediately. The Fengtai wanted 3 things. Where had the planes come from? Who else was involved? Whether the United States planned a second raid. DeShazer told them what every American serviceman in 1942 had been trained to say: name, rank, and serial number. They did not accept that answer. He was kept standing for 72 hours straight. He was denied food for 5 days at a stretch. He was beaten with bamboo rods across the kidneys, water tortured with a hose forced down his throat. He gave them nothing. None of the 8 Americans gave them anything that mattered. By August 1942, the Kempeitai had concluded the prisoners would not break, and the case was handed over to the Imperial Japanese Army for formal trial. The trial took one afternoon. It was held in a closed courtroom in Shanghai on August 28, 1942. The 8 Americans did not see the charges before they were read. The proceedings were conducted entirely in Japanese, with no translation provided. No defense counsel was assigned. The charge was the murder of Japanese civilians during the bombing of Nagoya and Tokyo on April 18th. The verdict for all 8 was guilty. The sentence for all 8 was death by firing squad. The sentence was then sent to Tokyo for review by Imperial General Headquarters. For 49 days, the 8 Americans sat in their cells in Shanghai, knowing they had been sentenced to die, not knowing when and not knowing whether all 8 would be carried out or only some. On October 14, 1942, the answer came. 3 of the 8 would die. 3, chosen apparently by random selection from the 8 names: Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, the Green Hornet pilot; Lieutenant William Farrow, DeShazer's own pilot from Bat Out of Hell; and Sergeant Harold Spatz, also from Crew 16, DeShazer's fellow raider, age 21. They were told that afternoon they had less than 24 hours. Farrow wrote a letter to his mother that the Japanese later refused to deliver. Hallmark wrote nothing. Spatz wrote to his father in Lebo, Kansas, "I want you to know I died fighting for my country like a soldier." The other 5 Americans, including DeShazer, were not told what had happened until weeks later. What happened in the next 40 months is not in the standard Doolittle raid story. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We are just getting to it. On October 15, 1942, at the Japanese Military Cemetery No. 1 in Shanghai, Hallmark, Farrow and Spatz were tied to wooden crosses blindfolded and shot by a 6-man Japanese firing squad at 4:30 p.m. local time. They were buried in unmarked graves. The 5 surviving Americans, DeShazer, Hite, Barr, Nielsen and Robert Meader, had their death sentences commuted to life imprisonment. They were transferred from Shanghai to a Japanese military prison in Nanking. They were placed in solitary confinement, in individual cells, measuring approximately 5 feet by 9 feet, with no contact with each other and no contact with the outside world. The Nanking prison was a former Chinese army barracks the Japanese had converted. The 5 Americans were kept in a row of cells along a stone corridor. They could hear each other cough. They were forbidden to speak. The cell light burned 24 hours a day. They were given 2 bowls of rice and a cup of weak tea per day. No exercise, no reading material, no mail, no notification that they had been declared dead by the United States War Department in May 1943, when the Japanese government finally announced that some of the Doolittle Raiders had been tried and punished, but refused to specify who or how. For 3 months, Jacob DeShazer's family in Madras, Oregon, believed he had been executed in Shanghai. Robert Meader, the navigator of Crew 6, died in the Nanking prison on December 1, 1943. The cause was beriberi and starvation. He was 26 years old. The other 4 Americans, DeShazer, Hite, Barr and Nielsen, were too weak to attend the burial. The Japanese guards told them about the death 3 days later, in a single sentence, in broken English. After Meader died, conditions improved slightly. The 4 survivors were given a thin blanket each. The ration was increased. In 1944, 25 months into his imprisonment, DeShazer was handed by a Japanese guard who could not read English and had been told to deliver it as a humanitarian gesture authorized by the Tokyo Military Command. He was given the book for 3 weeks. DeShazer read the Bible, the only book he had seen in over 2 years, for those 3 weeks, beginning in his cell on May 27, 1944. He read the New Testament first because it was shorter. He read it 3 times through. He later wrote, "I was a prisoner of Japan," that on June 8, 1944, In a Nanking solitary cell, with the cell light burning above him, he made a decision: if he survived the war, he would return to Japan as a Christian missionary. He would learn Japanese. He would spend the rest of his life there. The decision was made by a 31-year-old American bomber crewman who, at that moment, had no realistic expectation of ever leaving the cell alive. The Bible was taken back by the guard 3 weeks after it was given. DeShazer did not see another book for 14 months. In June 1945, the 4 surviving Americans were transferred to Fengtai prison outside Beijing. They were thinner than men generally are while still alive. Hite weighed 80 pounds. Barr was suffering acute psychiatric collapse and would not speak for weeks at a time. DeShazer had open sores on his back from sleeping on bamboo. Nielsen, the only one of the 4 still ambulatory, without assistance, was being used by the Japanese guards as an unpaid translator for the other prisoners. None of the 4 knew the war was ending. They did not know about the firebombing of Tokyo. They did not know about the atomic bombs. On August 20th, 1945, 5 days after Emperor Hirohito's surrender broadcast, an American OSS team parachuted into Fengtai and walked into the prison. The OSS officer commanding the rescue team was Major Ray Nichol. He found the 4 Americans in a row of cells in the prison interior. None of them recognized that they were being rescued for several minutes. DeShazer asked for water. Nichol gave him a canteen and a chocolate bar from his own pack. The first chocolate DeShazer had tasted in 3 years and 4 months. The 4 were flown to Chongqing within 48 hours, then to Kunming, then to Washington. They arrived in San Francisco on September 5, 1945. The press corps was waiting. DeShazer told reporters what he intended to do with the rest of his life. They printed it. Most of them assumed he would change his mind. He did not change his mind. Jacob DeShazer was discharged from the Army Air Forces in October 1945. He enrolled at Seattle Pacific College on the GI Bill. He earned a bachelor's degree in 1948. On December 28, 1948, 3 years and 4 months after his liberation from a Japanese prison cell, he sailed back to Japan on a passenger ship, this time with his wife Florence and an infant daughter, and a missionary commission from the Free Methodist Church. He landed at Yokohama on Christmas Eve, 1948. He moved his family into a small house in Osaka and began studying Japanese 5 hours a day. He stayed for the next 30 years. In 1950, DeShazer wrote a 12-page Christian tract titled "I Was a Prisoner of Japan." It was translated into Japanese and distributed across the country. In September of that year, at a Tokyo train station, the tract was handed to a 48-year-old former Imperial Navy commander named Mitsuo Fuchida. Fuchida had led the airstrike on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. He had given the radio call sign Tora Tora Tora. He read the tract on the train ride home. He sought DeShazer out. The 2 men met in 1950, the American who had bombed Nagoya and the Japanese who had bombed Pearl Harbor, in a Tokyo missionary office. Fuchida converted to Christianity the following year. He spent the rest of his life as a traveling evangelist, often appearing alongside DeShazer at joint speaking engagements. DeShazer founded 23 churches in Japan over his 30 years there. He preached in Nagoya, the city he had bombed in 1942, at least 14 times. He learned Japanese well enough to deliver his sermons in it without a translator. He refused all interviews about the Doolittle raid for the entirety of his missionary career. He told one biographer, late in his life, that he had only ever wanted to be known for what he did after April 18, 1942, and not for what he did on it. The man who had toggled 4 500-pound bombs over Nagoya in 1942 conducted Easter service in the same city in 1959, with a congregation of 200 Japanese Christians in a chapel he had personally helped build. Of the 4 men who survived solitary, George Barr never fully recovered from his psychological collapse and lived the rest of his life in and out of veterans' hospitals. He died on July 12, 1967, age 49. Robert Hite recovered, worked in the hotel business and lived until March 29, 2015, aged 95, the last surviving Doolittle Raider taken prisoner. Chase Nielsen testified at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal in 1946, identifying his Japanese captors. 4 were convicted, 3 executed. He lived until March 6, 2007, age 90. The 4 Japanese officers convicted of war crimes for the executions of Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz were sentenced at trial in 1946. The lead prosecutor in the case was an American military lawyer named Major Robert Dwyer, who used the testimony Nielsen and Hite provided as the foundation of the case. There is an argument that has run quietly through the Doolittle Raider Association meetings for decades. The Doolittle Raid is remembered as a strategic success. It boosted American morale at the lowest moment of the Pacific War. It forced the Japanese to recall 4 fighter groups to defend the home groups from the front to defend the home islands, and it directly influenced the Imperial Navy's decision to extend its perimeter to Midway, which led to the battle that broke Japanese carrier power 6 weeks later. Was the price worth it? 3 raiders shot in Shanghai, 1 starved to death in Nanking, 4 broken in solitary confinement for 40 months. An estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians killed by the Japanese in reprisals through the summer of 1942. The men who were on the raid never publicly answered. They left the question to history. Reverend Jacob DeShazer died on March 15, 2008. He was 95 years old. He died in his home in Salem, Oregon, surrounded by family. He is buried in the Bellcrest Memorial Park Cemetery, less than 30 miles from the Madras farm he had left in 1940. His Bible, the one a Japanese guard handed him in May 1944 in a Nanking prison cell, is held today at the Free Methodist Church Archives in Indianapolis, Indiana. The Doolittle Raiders, as an association, made their final toast at a 2013 ceremony at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Only 4 of the original 80 raiders were still alive. Richard Cole, Doolittle's own co-pilot, the last surviving raider, died in 2019 at age 103. The Bombardier who came home and forgave the country that had broken him. The Pearl Harbor pilot who walked into his Tokyo office. The 80 men who flew off the Hornet on a morning that turned the war. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served in the Pacific Theater in World War II, in the Army Air Forces, in the Navy, in the Marine Corps, in the OSS, in the Merchant Marine, on a B-25, on a carrier, in a Pacific prison, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, or one thing they said, or one thing you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.